As the officers hurried back to their patrol car, Marcus stepped closer to Maya, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his earlier intensity melting into genuine concern. Maya nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I am now," she whispered, hugging her kids tightly. Her youngest daughter looked up at Marcus with wide eyes. "Uncle Marcus, you're like a superhero," she exclaimed, making him chuckle despite the gravity of the moment. Karen, meanwhile, lingered awkwardly on her porch, clearly unsure whether to stay or flee. Marcus gave her a long, hard look, his expression unreadable. Without saying a word, he conveyed a simple message: "This isn't over." Sensing the unspoken threat, Karen scurried inside, slamming the door behind her. As the patrol car drove away, neighbors who had gathered began to disperse, some offering quiet words of support to Maya. Others simply shook their heads, murmuring about how wrong the whole situation had been. Marcus watched them go, his jaw tightening as he processed what had just happened. He knew this was far from just a personal victory. It was a reminder of how systemic issues persisted, even in seemingly peaceful communities. Turning to Maya, he spoke firmly but gently. "We're not done yet. This can't happen again, to you or anyone else. Let's talk about what comes next." Maya nodded, determination replacing the fear that had gripped her earlier. With Marcus by her side, she felt ready to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped softly, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. It was shaping up to be just another ordinary morning for Maya Johnson, a hard-working single mother who had built her life from scratch after leaving an abusive relationship years ago. She juggled long shifts at the hospital as a nurse while raising her 2 children, always striving to give them the best life possible despite the challenges she faced. That particular morning, Maya decided to start her day by running a quick errand. She loaded groceries into the trunk of her old but reliable sit-in, humming a tune under her breath. Her kids were playing in the front yard, laughing as they chased each other around. The scene was peaceful, until Karen Whitmore appeared out of nowhere. Karen was the kind of neighbor everyone whispered about behind closed doors. She had a knack for stirring up trouble, often inserting herself where she wasn't wanted or needed. With her arms crossed and a smug look on her face, Karen marched straight toward Maya. "Excuse me," Karen said loudly, drawing unnecessary attention. "Are those my packages you're loading into your car?" Maya stopped mid-motion, confused. She glanced at the bags in her hands, and then back at Karen. "What are you talking about?" "These are my groceries." But Karen wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed almost delighted by the confrontation. "Oh, really? Because I've been missing deliveries lately, and now I see you putting boxes into your car. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Maya sighed, feeling the weight of Karen's accusation pressing down on her. She knew exactly what this was, a baseless claim meant to cause problems. Still, she tried to remain calm. "Look, Karen, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not stealing anything. You can check my receipt if you want." Karen scoffed, clearly uninterested in reason. Instead, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911 with dramatic flair. "There's suspicious activity happening right outside my house," she announced into the receiver. "Yes, a woman is refusing to explain why she has items that don't belong to her." Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She watched helplessly as Karen hung up and smirked, clearly pleased with herself. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the tranquility of the neighborhood. 2 police officers arrived, stepping out of their patrol car with stern expressions. Their eyes immediately locked onto Maya, and their body language made it clear they already assumed she was guilty. One officer approached her, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Ma'am, we got a call about some stolen property. Can you explain what's going on here?" Maya took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just loading my groceries into my car. This lady," She gestured toward Karen, "is accusing me of something I didn't do." But the officers barely listened. They began asking questions rapidly, ignoring her explanations. One of them even started searching her car without permission, tossing her belongings around carelessly. Maya's kids, sensing their mom's distress, ran to her side, tears streaming down their faces. "Mommy, why are they doing this?" her youngest daughter asked, clutching her hand tightly. As the situation escalated, passers-by slowed down to watch the spectacle, shaking their heads but doing nothing to intervene. The once peaceful morning had turned into a nightmare, all because of one person's spiteful lie. Little did anyone know someone was about to arrive who would change everything, and ensure no one forgot this day anytime soon. The days following the incident brought a surprising wave of change to the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about what had happened, thanks in part to Mrs. Harper and a few other neighbors who felt compelled to share their side of the story. They talked openly at the local coffee shop, during school drop-offs, and even on social media, recounting how Maya, a hard-working single mother, had been unfairly targeted by both Karen and the police officers. The narrative shifted from gossip to outrage as more people learned the details. Maya herself became an unexpected figure of admiration. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began stopping by her house to offer support. Some dropped off baked goods or groceries, while others simply expressed their solidarity with kind words. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," one woman said, handing Maya a plate of cookies. "You deserve better than that." These small gestures meant the world to Maya, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Encouraged by Marcus, Maya decided to take things a step further. She organized a community meeting at the local library to discuss not only her experience, but also broader issues of racial profiling and accountability within law enforcement. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood, inviting everyone to attend. At first, Maya worried that turnout would be low. After all, these were sensitive topics that many preferred to avoid. But when the day arrived, the room was packed with residents eager to listen and contribute. Marcus played a key role in the meeting, using his military background and leadership skills to guide the discussion. He opened by sharing a brief overview of what had happened to Maya, emphasizing the importance of standing together against injustice. "This isn't just about my sister," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and respected. If we don't speak up now, nothing will change." One by one, neighbors stood up to share their own experiences. An elderly man recounted being pulled over repeatedly for no reason other than the color of his skin. A young mother described how her teenage son had been followed through a store simply because he was wearing a hoodie. Each story added weight to the conversation, highlighting patterns of discrimination that had long gone unaddressed. For many attendees, it was the first time they'd heard such personal accounts, and the impact was profound. Karen, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. Her attempts to defend her actions fell flat, especially after several neighbors confirmed her history of making baseless complaints. The Homeowners Association launched an investigation into her conduct, citing concerns about her behavior causing division in the community. Embarrassed and overwhelmed, Karen stopped attending neighborhood events altogether. Within weeks, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, signaling her decision to move away. As momentum grew, Maya and Marcus connected with local advocacy groups specializing in civil rights and police reform. These organizations provided valuable resources, including legal advice and strategies for filing formal complaints against the officers involved. Together, they drafted detailed reports outlining the misconduct Maya had endured, attaching witness statements and Marcus's video footage as evidence. The process was tedious but empowering, giving Maya a sense of agency she hadn't felt before. By the end of the week, the complaint had been submitted to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. While they knew it might take time to see results, Maya and Marcus remained optimistic. More importantly, the community itself had begun to transform. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening regularly, fostering understanding and unity among neighbors. For Maya, This newfound solidarity was priceless. She realized that while the road ahead might still be challenging, she had something powerful on her side, a network of people willing to stand with her. And with Marcus guiding her every step of the way, she felt ready to face whatever came next, not just for herself, but for the future of her children and everyone else who deserved fairness and respect. With the officers now visibly shaken, Marcus seized the opportunity to turn the tables completely. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. His calm demeanor was far more effective than any display of anger could have been. Instead, he began asking pointed questions, each one designed to expose the flaws in the officer's handling of the situation. "Can either of you tell me why my sister's car was searched without probable cause?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "Or why she wasn't given the chance to provide her side of the story before you assumed she was guilty?" The taller officer fumbled for words, glancing at his partner for backup. We were following up on a report, sir," he stammered, clearly struggling to justify their actions. "It's standard procedure to investigate claims like this." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Standard procedure, you say? Interesting. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you two arrived here with your minds already made up. You didn't ask questions. You accused. You didn't investigate. You harassed. That doesn't sound very standard to me." The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced by obvious unease. He glanced at Karen, who had retreated to the edge of her porch, looking increasingly nervous. She tried to interject again, her voice trembling as she said, "But they're just doing their job. She hasn't explained herself properly." Marcus ignored her entirely, focusing instead on the officers. "Let's set aside the neighbor's accusations for a moment," he continued, his voice steady and commanding. "What evidence do you actually have against my sister? Did anyone see her take anything? Is there surveillance footage? Or are we basing this entire ordeal on speculation?" The officers exchanged another uneasy glance, realizing they had no real answers to these questions. One of them muttered something about needing to review the details, but Marcus wasn't about to let them off that easily. "I'll tell you what," he said, pulling out his phone. "Why don't we document this interaction, just to ensure everything is above board?" He tapped the screen, activating the camera app and holding it up so everyone could see. The effect was immediate. Both officers stiffened, their body language shifting from defensive to outright panicked. They began speaking over each other, trying to downplay the situation. "Sir, there's no need for that," the taller officer said quickly. "We're just doing our duty here." "Your duty?" Marcus echoed, his voice dropping an octave. "Your duty is to protect and serve, not to intimidate innocent people based on baseless accusations. If you're confident you're following protocol, then you shouldn't have a problem with being recorded, right?" Neither officer responded. They exchanged yet another anxious look, clearly realizing they were outmatched. Meanwhile, Karen's confidence crumbled entirely. Seeing the tide turning against her, she took a hesitant step back, muttering under her breath. Marcus noticed but chose not to engage further. He knew she'd get hers later. For now, his priority was protecting Maya. Turning back to the officers, Marcus softened his tone slightly, though his message remained clear. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said. "You're going to apologize to my sister for the way you've treated her. Then you're going to leave. And if I hear so much as a whisper about this kind of behavior happening again, I'll make sure it gets escalated to the highest levels. Do I make myself clear?" The officers nodded hastily, their faces flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, sir," the shorter one mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "We're sorry for any misunderstanding." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Misunderstanding? This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was misconduct. But an apology is a start. He gestured toward Maya, who stood silently watching the exchange, still holding her children close. The taller officer cleared his throat awkwardly and turned to her. "Ma'am, we're sorry for the inconvenience. he said, his voice devoid of sincerity but laced with desperation. "We'll be leaving now." The ripple effects of Maya's courage and Marcus's intervention began to take shape in ways no one could have predicted. The Homeowners Association, spurred by mounting complaints from neighbors, conducted a thorough investigation into Karen's behavior. Her pattern of making false accusations and stirring up trouble came to light, painting a clear picture of someone who thrived on drama and division. When confronted with the evidence, Karen tried to downplay her actions, claiming she was just looking out for the neighborhood. But her excuses fell flat, especially since multiple witnesses corroborated Maya's version of events. Faced with the threat of formal action and likely ostracism from the community, Karen made the decision to sell her house and leave the neighborhood. Within weeks, moving trucks arrived, and soon enough, her home had new owners, a young interracial couple with 2 children, who quickly became beloved members of the community. Neighbors joked that karma had finally caught up with Karen, though most agreed it was better to focus on welcoming positivity rather than dwelling on negativity. As for the officers involved, their misconduct didn't go unnoticed either. The Internal Affairs Department reviewed the complaint Maya filed, along with Marcus's video footage and witness statements. Though investigations like these often dragged on, there was undeniable pressure this time due to the growing attention the case received. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting how a single mother's ordeal had sparked conversations about accountability and systemic bias. The officers were placed on temporary suspension pending further review, a move that sent shockwaves through the precinct. For Maya, seeing even partial justice felt empowering. It wasn't perfect. She knew real change would require bigger efforts, but it was progress. Encouraged by Marcus, she decided to channel her energy into advocacy work. She joined forces with local organizations focused on police reform and racial equality, attending workshops and speaking at panel discussions. Her experiences gave her a platform, and she used it wisely, sharing her story not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action. Marcus continued to support her every step of the way, offering advice and encouragement when needed. He also connected Maya with lawyers specializing in civil rights cases, ensuring she had access to legal resources if the situation required escalation. Together, they drafted letters to city officials, demanding greater transparency and training within law enforcement agencies. Their persistence paid off when the mayor announced plans to implement mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, a small victory, but a meaningful one. Meanwhile, the neighborhood transformed in subtle yet significant ways. People who had once kept to themselves now greeted each other warmly, forming bonds over shared values of fairness and respect. Community meetings became regular occurrences, giving residents a space to voice concerns and brainstorm solutions collaboratively. Even Mr. Patel, who rarely spoke, started volunteering to organize cleanup drives and neighborhood events. The sense of unity was palpable, and Maya couldn't help but feel proud of what they'd accomplished together. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Maya's children. Watching their mom stand up for herself and seeing their uncle fight so fiercely for justice left an indelible mark on them. They learned valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, as Maya tucked her youngest daughter into bed, the little girl looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, are you a superhero too?" she asked innocently. Maya chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart," she replied softly. "I'm just someone trying to make things better, for us and for everyone else." Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Maya faced them with newfound strength. With Marcus by her side and a supportive community behind her, she felt ready to tackle anything life threw her way. What had started as a harrowing day had turned into a catalyst for growth, healing, and hope, not just for Maya and her family, but for the entire neighborhood. And as she stood on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized something important. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead to the brightest beginnings. The officers didn't waste any time. One of them stood towering over Maya, his arms crossed and his expression unyielding, while the other rummaged through her car as if it were a crime scene. Groceries, cereal boxes, milk cartons, and bags of fresh produce were tossed onto the ground carelessly, scattering across the driveway. Maya's heart sank as she watched her hard-earned essentials being treated like evidence in some imaginary theft. She clenched her fists tightly, trying to keep her composure for the sake of her children, who clung to her legs, their small faces streaked with tears. "Ma'am, do you mind explaining why this neighbor says you're taking things that don't belong to you?" The taller officer asked again, his tone dripping with suspicion. His partner chimed in, holding up a bag of apples as if it were contraband. "And how did you afford all this? Looks like quite the haul." Maya felt a surge of frustration bubbling inside her. How could they twist something so simple into something sinister? She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, Karen interjected from the sidelines. Standing on her porch with a self-satisfied smirk, Karen called out, "See, she's avoiding the question. That's what guilty people do." The officers exchanged glances, seemingly convinced by Karen's theatrics. They ignored Maya's protests entirely, treating her more like a suspect than a person trying to live her life. Every attempt she made to clarify the situation was met with dismissive remarks or outright mockery. "You'd be surprised how many people think they can get away with stuff," one of them said coldly, shaking his head as though he'd already convicted her in his mind. Maya's youngest child tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, tell them we didn't steal anything." Her older daughter stood silently, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Maya knelt down briefly, hugging them close. "It's okay, babies," she murmured softly, though her own voice trembled slightly. "We didn't do anything wrong." But even as she reassured her kids, she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness washing over her. Why wouldn't anyone listen? Karen, meanwhile, leaned against her porch railing, clearly enjoying the chaos she had created. She glanced around at the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle, soaking up the attention. A few looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed the unfair treatment unfolding before them. Others simply stared blankly, unwilling to step in or risk becoming targets themselves. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an uncomfortable mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. As the minutes dragged on, Maya's patience began to wear thin. She took a deep breath and tried once more to reason with the officers. "Look, I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. I work long hours to take care of my family. I don't have time for games like this. You can call my employer, check my ID, anything you need. But please stop wasting your time and mine." For a moment, there was silence. The officers hesitated, exchanging another glance, but ultimately shrugged off her words. "We'll decide what's necessary, Mom," the shorter one replied curtly. He continued jotting notes on his clipboard, acting as though he hadn't heard a word she said. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. A dusty pickup truck rounded the corner and pulled up behind the patrol cars. Out stepped a man dressed in casual clothes, his broad shoulders and confident stride immediately drawing attention. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in every detail: the scattered groceries, the tearful children, the smug neighbor, and the two officers hovering over Maya like predators circling their prey. Marcus Johnson had returned home earlier than expected, eager to surprise his sister after months of being deployed overseas. What he found instead was a situation that ignited a fire within him. Without hesitation, he strode forward, his presence commanding enough to make everyone pause. Even the officers straightened up instinctively, sensing that this newcomer wasn't someone to be trifled with. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked calmly, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to look at him, including Maya, whose eyes widened in shock and relief at the sight of her brother. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a flicker of hope. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: Marcus wasn't going to let this injustice slide without a fight. In the months that followed, Maya's life began to settle into a new rhythm. One defined not by fear or frustration, but by purpose and resilience. The ordeal that had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge had become a turning point, shaping her into someone stronger and more determined than ever before. She continued working as a nurse, pouring her heart into caring for others, but she also embraced her role as an advocate for change. Her story resonated far beyond the confines of her neighborhood, inspiring people from all walks of life to speak out against injustice. Maya started attending city council meetings regularly, armed with research and first-hand accounts of systemic issues within law enforcement. At first, speaking in front of large crowds made her nervous. Her voice would tremble slightly, and she gripped the podium tightly. But over time, she grew more confident. She learned how to articulate her experiences clearly, weaving personal anecdotes with data to drive her points home. Her courage inspired others to join her cause, including some of the very neighbors who had once stood silently on the sidelines during her confrontation with the officers. Together, they formed a coalition dedicated to promoting police reform and fostering accountability. Marcus remained her steadfast ally, offering guidance whenever needed. Though his military duties often took him away, he stayed involved in the fight for justice, connecting Maya with influential figures and organizations that could amplify their efforts. During one particularly memorable visit, he accompanied her to a statewide conference on civil rights, where she delivered a powerful speech about the importance of community solidarity. "We can't wait for change to happen," she told the audience, her voice steady and impassioned. "We have to be the ones to create it." Her words struck a chord, earning applause that rippled through the auditorium. Afterward, strangers approached her to express gratitude, sharing their own stories of discrimination and hardship. Maya listened intently, nodding along as they spoke. Each encounter reminded her why this work mattered, not just for herself, but for countless others who felt unseen and unheard. Back at home, Maya's children thrived under the influence of their mother's newfound strength. They watched proudly as she balanced her roles as a caregiver, advocate, and leader, learning valuable lessons about perseverance and compassion. One afternoon, while helping her daughter with a school project about heroes, Maya realized something profound. She didn't need a cape or superpowers to make a difference. Simply standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, was enough to inspire those around her. The neighborhood, too, continued to evolve. The for sale sign on Karen's old house came down, replaced by laughter and warmth as the new family settled in. Block parties became a regular occurrence, bringing residents together to celebrate milestones, holidays, and even everyday moments. Conversations shifted from gossip and division to collaboration and mutual support. People looked out for one another, checking in on elderly neighbors, organizing carpools for kids' activities, and sharing meals during tough times. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and misunderstandings. But the sense of unity was undeniable. As for Karen, whispers occasionally reached Maya about her struggles to fit in elsewhere. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales served as a reminder of the consequences of sowing discord. Yet Maya chose not to dwell on bitterness. Instead, she focused on building bridges rather than burning them. Forgiveness, she realized, was a form of strength, not weakness. One evening, as Maya sat on her porch watching the sunset, Marcus joined her, handing over a cup of coffee. "You've come a long way," he said, his tone filled with pride. Maya smiled, taking the sip before responding. "We all have," she corrected gently. "This isn't just my journey. It's ours. And I think we're finally headed in the right direction." The sky glowed orange and pink, casting a soft light over the quiet streets. Children played in the distance, their laughter echoing through the air. For the first time in years, Maya felt truly at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew she was part of something bigger than herself. Life would always have its challenges, but she was no longer afraid to face them head-on. With her brother by her side, her children cheering her on, and a community united behind her, Maya stepped boldly into the future, ready to keep fighting for a world where everyone could feel safe, valued, and free. After the officers sped away, their patrol car disappearing around the corner, Marcus wasted no time. He turned to Maya, his expression serious but supportive. "We need to handle this properly," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about today. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Maya nodded, her earlier fear replaced by a growing sense of resolve. She knew her brother was right. They couldn't let this incident slide without consequences. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the recording app, replaying the footage he'd captured during the confrontation. "This is evidence," he explained, showing Maya. "It proves exactly how those officers behaved. But we'll need more than just my word or theirs. We need witnesses." He glanced at the neighbors who were still lingering nearby, some watching curiously while others avoided eye contact altogether. "Let's start with them," Marcus suggested, gesturing toward the crowd. Maya hesitated for a moment, unsure if anyone would actually step forward. After all, most of these people had stood silently on the sidelines while she was being harassed. But Marcus wasn't deterred. "Sometimes people just need someone to ask," he said firmly. Together, they approached the small group of neighbors. Marcus took the lead, addressing them directly but respectfully. "I know what you saw here today wasn't fair," he began, his tone measured yet compelling. "And I'm asking for your help to make sure it doesn't happen again. If anyone is willing to share what they witnessed, or even just confirm that my sister was treated unfairly, we'd really appreciate it." At first, there was silence. Some neighbors shuffled awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, while others exchanged hesitant glances. Then, an older woman named Mrs. Harper stepped forward. She lived 2 houses down and had always been kind to Maya, often waving hello when their paths crossed. "I saw everything," she admitted quietly, wringing her hands nervously. "It didn't look right. Those officers came in like she'd done something terrible, and she clearly hadn't." Marcus smiled warmly, encouraging her. "Thank you for speaking up, ma'am. Would you be willing to write down what you saw? Or maybe talk to someone officially if needed?" Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, her voice gaining strength. "Yes, I will. This shouldn't have happened." Her courage seemed to inspire others. A young couple who lived across the street chimed in next, agreeing that the officer's behavior had been excessive. Even Mr. Patel, who rarely spoke to anyone, offered a nod of solidarity. "I saw the groceries scattered everywhere," he said gruffly. "That lady, Karen, she started the whole thing. It was ridiculous." As more neighbors added their voices, Maya felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. For so long, she'd felt isolated in this neighborhood, as though she didn't quite belong. But now, seeing these people stand up for her, even if belatedly, made her realize she wasn't alone after all. Marcus, too, seemed pleased with the response. "This is good," he told Maya under his breath. "With statements from multiple witnesses, we can build a strong case." Once they'd gathered enough support, Marcus shifted his focus to Karen. Walking briskly toward her house, he knocked sharply on the door. When she cracked it open just enough to peek outside, he fixed her with a steely gaze. "You caused a lot of trouble today," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. "False accusations aren't just cruel, they're illegal. Think carefully about whether you want to keep stirring the pot, because trust me, I'll make sure you regret it if you do." Karen's face paled, and she stammered something incoherent before slamming the door shut. Though Marcus didn't press further, his warning lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Neighbors whispered among themselves, speculating about how Karen might react, or whether she'd finally learn her lesson. Back at Maya's house, Marcus helped her clean up the scattered groceries, which had been trampled during the chaos. As they worked side by side, he outlined the next steps. "First, we file a formal complaint against the officers," he explained. "Their actions were unprofessional and discriminatory, and that needs to be documented. Then we reach out to local advocacy groups. They'll know how to escalate this issue if necessary. Maya listened intently, feeling empowered for the first time all day. With Marcus guiding her and the community rallying behind her, she realized she had the tools to fight back. What had started as a nightmare was turning into an opportunity, not just for justice, but for real change. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood, Maya felt a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was ready to thrive, and to make sure no one else had to endure what she had. The moment Marcus stepped out of his truck, the energy of the entire scene shifted. His commanding presence was impossible to ignore. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet authority, he exuded confidence without saying a word. Years of training in the Delta Force had honed not just his physical strength, but also his ability to assess situations quickly and take control when necessary. As he approached the group, his piercing gaze moved methodically from the officers to Karen, and finally landed on his sister, Maya, whose face lit up with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus repeated, his voice calm but firm. The tone alone demanded respect, and everyone within earshot felt its weight. Even the officers, who had been so dismissive of Maya moments earlier, seemed to straighten their posture unconsciously. One of them cleared his throat before responding, attempting to sound authoritative despite the sudden change in dynamics. "We're handling a situation, sir," the taller officer said, gesturing vaguely toward Maya. "This woman is being questioned about some missing items reported by her neighbor." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He glanced at Maya, silently asking if she was okay. She gave him a small nod, though her hands were still trembling slightly as she held onto her children. Turning back to the officers, Marcus crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, studying them like a chess player evaluating his opponent's next move. "I see," Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "And what exactly led to this situation? Did someone witness my sister taking these alleged items?" The shorter officer shuffled uncomfortably, glancing at Karen for support. Sensing the spotlight returning to her, Karen stepped forward, pointing dramatically at Maya. "That's right," she exclaimed, her voice rising an octave. "I've seen her acting suspiciously around my property. And now all these groceries. It doesn't add up." Marcus turned his attention to Karen, his expression unreadable. There was something about the way he looked at her, a mix of curiosity and disdain, that made her falter mid-sentence. For the first time since the confrontation began, Karen's confident demeanor cracked ever so slightly. She took a half-step back, clutching her arms defensively. "Interesting," Marcus said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Then, addressing the officers again, he added, "So let me get this straight. My sister, a working mother and nurse, is being accused of stealing groceries based solely on this woman's claim. No actual evidence, just hearsay." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. They weren't used to civilians questioning their actions so directly, especially not someone who carried themselves with such undeniable authority. One of them finally spoke up, though his words lacked conviction. "We have to investigate any report we receive, sir. It's protocol." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their explanation. But then he leaned in slightly, his body language shifting into what could only be described as intimidating, not aggressive, but undeniably dominant. "Fair enough," he said smoothly. "But I assume you're following proper procedures, correct? Like identifying yourselves and explaining your reasoning to the person being questioned." The taller officer hesitated, his hand instinctively reaching for his badge. Before he could. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Neighbors who had been watching quietly from a distance began whispering among themselves, some nodding in agreement. The officers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were losing control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Karen tried to interject again, her voice shrill. "You don't understand. She's lying." Marcus didn't even glance at her. Instead, He reached into his pocket and pulled out his military ID, holding it up for the officers to see. "Before we go any further," he said evenly, "you should know who you're dealing with. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I'm a Delta Force operator. Now, I'd appreciate it if you treated my sister with the respect she deserves, or we can escalate this conversation to include your superiors." The mention of Delta Force hit like a thunderclap. Both officers froze, their faces pale as they processed the implications. The shorter one stammered, "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Their earlier bravado evaporated completely, replaced by nervous deference. Maya watched in awe as her brother effortlessly dismantled the hostile atmosphere that had engulfed her just moments ago. Her heart swelled with gratitude and pride. She knew Marcus had always been protective of her, but seeing him in action reminded her just how fortunate she was to have him in her corner. Whatever happened next, she realized, things were about to change, for better or worse.